There's a new version of the Horus Heresy game out, so if you're interested in playing in the Age of Darkness, I thought I'd do an intro video to the lore, to the models, and to the factions you can play, and to the game itself, and how it's a little different to the 40k you might be used to. Hey look, there's merch on a merch store. Details of how you can get some are in the thing below. Okay, the basics. The Age of Darkness is Games Workshop's third largest game system after Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar, and it's the largest physical game Games Workshop produce. It's a full-size war game played on a 6x4 board with its own massive range of Citadel miniatures, gamebooks and expansions, its own events and painting community, and rules discussions, and overall, a massive part of what Games Workshop currently make, and it's currently in its third edition. The Saturnine starter box was announced in May 2025 with a range of all new models and a complete set of updated rules set for summer release. And so it's likely that all that hype might draw some new people towards the war-torn galaxy of the Horus Heresy. But the Horus Heresy game system has been a few different things over the years, and that can make it a bit daunting to just jump into. So in this video, I'm going to provide what I hope to be the perfect intro to the lore, to the factions and the models available, the game system and the community, and the culture of the game, so you know what's what. The Horus Heresy as a setting for gaming was originally released in 2012 as an expansion to Warhammer 40k. Back then, it used the same rulebook as 6th edition 40k, but with its own factions and model range. In those days, it was published by Forge World. Most of the models, apart from a few basic troops, were resin, and the rules were released in these massive tomes known as Black Books, which were a mix of lore, army books and campaign supplements. However, Warhammer 40k went through some pretty big changes in the years after that, and a few editions later, during the switch to 8th edition 40k in 2017, that game was totally rewritten from the ground up in a way that didn't really take into account Heresy's existence at all. That was still running on the old rules. So, after a few years of confusion and interim rulebooks when they realised that by stopping selling 40k, that also stopped selling the rulebook to Heresy anyway, a complete second edition was released in 2022. This time a standalone game with its own rule set and a new set of plastic models, with many of those old resin conversion kits being switched over to plastic and previously all resin armies receiving new plastic ranges. And during the release of that edition, we also had other games set during the Horus Heresy. Both Adeptus Titanicus and Legions Imperialis are set during the Horus Heresy era, but they're a different game system and I'm not going to go into them here. And in 2025, after 3 years, it's moved into its third edition, again with an updated rule set, but it's worth saying that all these changes have just been updates. If you had played Heresy back in 2012, or really played any form of Warhammer 40k, a lot of the Heresy game is going to feel pretty familiar. The current third edition release box is called Saturnine and includes everything you need to start, including the rulebook. These boxes are often pictured as being painted as two small armies, but most people often combine all their models into one army. And if you do that, you get most of the way towards having a full-size force straight out of the box. You don't need a lot more to be event ready. So that's the game we're playing. Let's talk about the setting. The Horus Heresy game is predictably set during the galaxy-wide civil war that was the Horus Heresy, that happened 10,000 years before modern 40k. The Horus Heresy occurred at the end of the Great Crusade, a barely remembered time of myth and legend when legions of Space Marines bestrode the stars and forged the Imperium, led by the Emperor himself and his 20 Primarchs. But the Emperor's favoured son, the War Master Horus, was corrupted by the forces of chaos and turned half of his brothers to his side. And in 10 short years, much of what had been built was set aflame as the War Master's armies consolidated their forces and then burned a path to terror, culminating in the siege of the Emperor's palace, where Horus was killed and the Emperor injured, forever being bound to the Golden Throne. The game is set right in the middle of that war. Across the galaxy, war fronts have opened up, either loyalists trying to build defenses in order to stop the progress of the traitors, or traitors invading planets to get more resources. Special missions are launched, operations are conducted behind enemy lines, and giant set-piece battles occur as the traitors march to terror. If you've read the massive series of Black Library novels, then you'll know that one of the big themes of the lore is confusion. The loyalists don't expect the heresy at all. The traitor legions can often be quite fractious, and all the legions were spread out across the galaxy when this war broke out. The Space Marine legions weren't just a big army led by a Primarch. They were split up into task forces and fleets engaged on numerous fronts in wars of compliance against human planets or wars against aliens. Some didn't even find out about the heresy till way later. They were operating on some far-flung warfront with out-of-date equipment for decades. Some Astartes had never met their Primarch and might have taken the opposite side in the war, siding with Horus or the Emperor against their own legion. And the war left remnants and isolated units behind in its wake. The first official conflict in the heresy was the drop site massacre of Istvan V, which decimated the Raven Guard, Iron Hands and Salamanders legions. Their leaderless remnants would go on to form something called the Shattered Legions, ad hoc guerrilla units that harried the War Master's forces as they tried to advance. And that's just the Space Marines. The heresy also drew in everyone else in the Imperium, from the Imperial Army and the Solar Auxilia units that accompanied their Crusade fleets and were drawn into the war with their commanding legions, to all the planets who suddenly had to pick a side, aware if they picked the wrong one, that enemies might burn their homeworld for their disobedience. Even Mars, seat of the mighty Mechanicum, the precursor to the Adeptus Mechanicus, fell to the traitors, and Forge worlds and night planets across the galaxy declared for one side or the other. And all this happens in a world where the threat of chaos is very new. The powers of the warp and those who embrace them aren't yet facts of life in the Imperium. They're terrifying new horrors no one really knows how to control, unleashed on the galaxy. The whole setting has this great feeling of paranoia, confusion and desperation, even more than in 40k, as ragged bands of Space Marines or human soldiers attempt to fight on through the ruins of the empire they just created. It's a really evocative setting, helped along by the fact that a lot of the game's supplements are centered around very famous battles from the novels. So this mix of a really chaotic, confusing setting, but also with some set-piece historical events, allows players and collectors a lot of freedom. You can play the famed personalities and massive important battles of the era, but there's also loads of room for people to tell their own stories or create their own unique armies. And speaking of armies, one of the common criticisms of the Horus Heresy game is that it's all just Space Marines, but that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. There are a load of different factions you can play, and the way in which army building works means that two armies from the same faction can feel very, very different from each other. First, the most important choice to make is if your army is loyalist or traitor. All armies in the Horus Heresy have to pick one of these. Almost every faction had loyalist and traitor elements, so you're not restricted that much, but which one you choose will affect which named characters you can choose, because we know what side they fought on in the books, and there also are some armies like, say, Custodes, who just can't be traitor. The primary factions, the ones you'll see most of all, are the 18 Space Marine legions that mostly followed their Primarchs into the war on the side of either Horus's traitors or the loyalists defending the Emperor and Terror. These are the main characters of the game setting and of the novels, divided into the 9 Loyalist legions: Dark Angels, White Scars, Space Wolves, Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, Iron Hands, Ultramarines, Salamanders and Raven Guard, and the 9 traitor ones: Emperor's Children, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, World Eaters, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, Sons of Horus, Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. In the game, all those legions use the same basic army list, and have access to the same basic units and upgrades. Units in Heresy tend to have a very large number of war gear options, allowing a lot more customization than in some other Games Workshop games. As with most Games Workshop games, the armies are built to a points limit, and the units, as well as all the upgrades, have points costs, so you need to allow points for the sort of guns you want to be able to afford rather than just getting the best loadout for free. The models for this faction are mostly available as fully plastic kits, with some of the more unique units being a mix of plastic and resin, but the vast majority of the range is plastic by now, and that's only increasing. In fact, some units even have multiple plastic kits available to represent them, with the only difference being the aesthetics. A Mark 6 and Mark 3 tactical squad are identical in game. They're just tactical squads. The reason you have different boxes is so you can pick the armor you like the most. The rules for this faction are divided between two books. The Liber Astartes contains the basic list and the rules for the 9 loyal legions, and the Liber Hereticus contains the same basic list but the rules for the 9 traitor legions. Which legion you pick adds on extra stuff. Called Rites of War, each legion gets a number of extra rules that change what the basic Marines in the army can do, plus legion-specific reactions, special equipment, characters, and units, usually unique veteran squads, famed characters from the novels, and of course, their Primarchs. These Legion-specific units and characters are usually made as resin models or upgrade kits. All armies in the Horus Heresy are selected via a system of detachments. Units are divided between specific roles like troops or command or heavy assault, and you fill up the detachment's force organization chart, which allows different numbers of those roles. The more officers you include in your army, the more specialist detachments you can add to your army. And that sort of themes the army as you go. There's no way you can include all the detachments, so you need to pick if you're adding an armored detachment or recon detachment to your army. And of course, each legion's rite of war adds a number of unique detachments for that legion. This means that while many of the armies you'll see are Space Marines, different combinations of allegiance, detachment, and legion all make those armies really different on the table. Despite them using the same basic army list, playing with a loyalist Death Guard armoured company is going to feel like a totally different game to playing with a traitor, word-bearer, orbital assault force. And of course, there are armies that aren't Space Marines. The Mechanicum of Mars fought on both sides of the war, and in the Heresy era, they're a much weirder, more independent force than they would become in 40k. The Tagmata of the Forge Worlds comprise cybernetically augmented troops, swathes of ancient robot chassis, and esoteric weapons platforms, and these are again very customizable. Your force could be from the Legio Cybernetica, spearheaded by battle robots, or represent the armor and artillery of the Ordo Reductor, or even the warp-dabbling heretics that would eventually become the Dark Mechanicum, building their first demon engines. The Mechanicum range is by now a mostly plastic range. A few special units are still resin, and their rules are in the Liber Mechanicum. Night worlds are still a thing in the Heresy, and Questoris Knights also fought on both sides, making use of much more varied and advanced suits than in 40k. Heresy allows you to theme these into chaos-corrupted houses too, and the Titan Legions are similarly represented. Not only can you take the range of Forge World Titans, but they have enough troops choices to comprise their own small army if you want. Most of the basic Knight models will be familiar to 40k players. The plastic Questoris, Cerastus, and Armiger kits are the same, with the biggest Knights and Titans again available as resin. The rules for both armies are in the Liber Questoris. And the legions were supported by millions of regular human soldiers, in this era known as the Imperial Army, that were drawn from the many planets the campaign conquered. The pinnacle of these are the regiments of the Solar Auxilia, a pattern of army regiment invented by the Void Nations of Saturn and Jupiter, and which the Imperium was slowly adopting as its new army standard just as the Heresy broke out. Solar Auxilia are designed to operate in the void or to garrison the conquests the Legion makes after the Legion moved on, and they're equipped with the finest weapons and armour Imperial forges can manufacture. On the table, they work as a numerous gun line, reliant on formation fighting, massed armour, and well-placed officers to stand up to the brutality of a Space Marine army. The Solar Auxilia are again another army which is mostly fully transitioned to plastic. There are still some resin models left, and their rules are in the Liber Auxilia. And also the loyal forces of the Emperor are abroad in the galaxy throughout the campaign. The Legio Custodes 10,000 strong are the bodyguard and agents of the Emperor and continued to fight for the loyalist cause. This is one of the armies that has a significant crossover with the 40k range. They're supported by the Sisters of Silence, which in the Heresy era is a significantly larger fighting force with a much larger complete army list than it has in 40k. Both of these are planned to be released as PDF armies with the intention of a liber coming down the line, and there are also a few other armies available as PDFs from earlier versions of the game. The Imperial army forces can also be represented by the much larger and more varied Imperialis Militia, which is much more like a 40k guard army, more flexible than the Auxilia, but way less rigidly drilled and obviously worse equipped. This list could represent the defense forces of some far-flung planet or the hordes of cultists that followed the traitors. And then, as the heresy wore on and chaos became more common, invasions of demons became a thing. Demons are another PDF-only army that allows you to use regular Warhammer demon models in the game. And then, as well as the actual factions, there are numerous alternative army types and allies. Assassins were used in armies on both sides. The Knights Errant of Malcador were dispatched to the front lines, and the Astartes themselves came up with lots of unorthodox new formations, such as Shattered Legions, armies composed of warriors from lots of different legions, or Black Shields, Space Marines who went rogue, covered their armour, and fought for no one at all. So yeah, it's a surprising amount of factions for a game that's just Space Marines. The actual tabletop game itself is an interesting one. It's recognisably a Warhammer game, but it has a very different feel to Warhammer 40k. In terms of publications, it follows a model similar to many other Games Workshop games. The core rulebook is the Age of Darkness rulebook, available in the starter set and on its own, and then each army has its faction rules available in its liber. Then, as the edition goes on, various campaign books are released with additional rules and units and missions for specific battles. To play the game, you'll need the rulebook, the liber for your army, a bunch of 6-sided dice and tape measures, like all Games Workshop games, and then 2 specific items, a scatter dice and a set of blast templates, both of which come in the starter box, but you can also pretty easily track them down online. There are a few models, really big, super heavy ones, which might require some of the really big blast templates. They're a separate set, but they're only really relevant for a few giant mega weapons. Most people won't need them starting out. As I mentioned at the start of this, when Heresy was first released, it was an expansion to 6th edition Warhammer 40k, using all the same rules, but in the years following, 40k and Heresy kind of diverged. During the change from 7th to 8th edition 40k, its rules were completely rewritten, and it became the game it is today, a much more streamlined game than it used to be, with very simple and easy to learn core rules, but lots and lots of different faction and unit rules that add on to that. By comparison, Heresy stuck with the rules design system from before. It took 7th edition 40k and sort of cleaned it up, still streamlining and improving the game, just in a different direction, and without the complete start from scratch that 40k got. This means that while there are a lot of similarities between the 40k and Heresy game systems, models still have broadly the same stats, the game turn has a move, shooting and assault phase, attacks still require a hit, wound and save roll, all things that are familiar to many of the Warhammer games, the two games have ended up feeling very different. The simplest way I could describe this is that, to me, 40k feels like a big board game, or maybe an RTS video game. Units have a load of wounds, like a health bar, which you need to whittle down by combined firepower. The game is about deck building, and then playing your units against theirs, spending yours to remove theirs like Magic the Gathering. A friend of mine likened it to a math puzzle. How many points do I need to spend in your firepower to reduce your health enough to remove that? How many units do I need to expend to get that objective? While there is obviously a huge lore element and very pretty models, the game of 40k feels a lot more like a board game. Sometimes the models themselves, or the idea of trying to recreate the feel of a battle, is secondary to playing a tight competitive game. By comparison, I'd say that Heresy sacrifices a lot of that streamlining to retain the feel of a war game, with all the detail and confusion of battle that entails. Units usually have fewer wounds and are a lot easier to remove, especially if you have the right weapon for the job. Morale and leadership are really important. Units might fall back, be pinned or suppressed by incoming fire, and a single round of assault if it goes well, might see one side collapse, running away or being cut down. Unit leaders are really important for trying to resist that, and enemy snipers are therefore a very specific threat. There are a number of ways to render the enemy army ineffectual and win that aren't just depleting their health bars till they remove models. Positioning really matters, especially when using vehicles, which have to balance the speed of movement with accuracy of fire. Getting around the side or rear of vehicles makes them way more vulnerable. Vehicles in general aren't just big infantry models with a bigger health bar, they get hurt and damaged in a completely different way. Generally, weapons and equipment in Heresy are a bit more all or nothing. No amount of bolter fire from small arms will ever plink wounds off of a tank. You need the right tool to kill the right thing. And if you point that tank hunting las cannon at an infantry model, they don't get a modifier to their save, they just don't get one. Building an army becomes this game of trying to make sure your force has enough ways of dealing with all the different threats that might pop up. And there are loads of ways of doing that aren't just have enough ways of killing them. Terrain also provides a variety of benefits and drawbacks that encourage very varied battlefields. It doesn't need to be line of sight blocking to be effective in the game. And then there are other rules that are retained just for the feel of it. Blast weapons are represented by templates that can scatter. Characters can engage in challenges and duels in the centre of combat. Stuff that gives you big cinematic make or break moments. I don't really know if there's a better way to describe the feel of the games like that. Heresy feels more like a large-scale war game where the goal is to recreate an exciting battle, and less like a competitive board game or a strategy video game. Because of this, while many of the rules will be familiar to existing Warhammer players, there are just more rules and more things you can do with the rules, which of course makes it a slightly harder game to learn. The core rules you need to play a game are longer and more complex than in either 40k or Age of Sigmar. But the flip side of that is that while you need to learn more rules to play, once you've done that, the factions don't introduce many more. It's harder to be gotcha'd by things you don't know because the faction-specific rules are quite light. Also, building an army in Heresy is a bit more restrictive. It follows force organisation charts with units grouped into one of 6 battlefield roles and strict limits on how many you can take, which means that Heresy armies often look a bit more like a believable army, a core of troops and a limited number of support units and characters, rather than a collection of whatever's the best right now. And speaking to that, Heresy also refreshes its rules at a much slower rate than 40k. It seems to be running on the standard 3-year release cycle Games Workshop use for a lot of their games, but most faction rules are available on release, and they tend to just get the odd FAQ to clarify things rather than multiple balance updates a year, match play packs, and extra codex releases. The goalposts move a lot less. Standard games are 3,000 points a side, which is about this big, but 2,000 points is pretty common too, and the setting has its own boarding assault equivalent, Zone Mortalis, which is a smaller variant of the game fought in the depths of spaceships. Of course, this large and complicated rule set means that it's not quite as tightly monitored or tightly written as 40k, and it requires a bit more of a forgiving nature to play, which is fine, because all those changes have resulted in quite a different gaming culture. Generally, Horus Heresy has a much more narrative or casual gaming culture than 40k or even Age of Sigmar, really. In fact, the culture around the game is a pretty good example of a functioning narrative wargame. Most Heresy players like to treat it like a recreation of a historical battle, where the goal is to tell an interesting story rather than just prove how skillful you are. Don't get me wrong, people still want to play a functional, balanced tabletop game. They still want to be able to test their skill against the enemy and all that. It's just that that's not the only priority. Heresy players tend to want it to feel right, to feel like an urgent battle, and for the armies to look right, like they're really in this massive civil war. Just building the most meta list to dominate on the table is generally frowned on. There are some people like that. I mean, there are always some people like that, but it's criticised pretty heavily. And when stuff does come out that's obviously overpowered, the community are usually pretty quick to adopt some simple rules that limit it. For example, in the last version of the game, contempt to dreadnoughts were generally agreed to be way too good for their points, but everyone still wants to use them, they're iconic, so the community quickly adopted a general rule of only allowing 1 per 1,000 points of the army, and that sort of became a norm at every single event and in a lot of casual play. Generally, the Heresy community don't mind that sort of thing if it makes the game fairer for everyone, and specifically if it allows more different sorts of armies. Contemptors are cool, but no one wants to feel like they're forced to bring 3 or they lose. I think this is probably because the game started out in the very early days as mostly a series of modelling projects. Can I make an army that feels like this story from the Heresy books? I don't think I've ever seen unpainted armies in Heresy, and people really want to be able to bring their weird and unique army with its own story. So kit bashing and conversion is really encouraged. They want to have a unique force full of weird, unique models, and so they want a gaming culture where all of that is playable, rather than one where you have to build the specific best thing to get a fair game. As another example, there's a Legends equivalent in Heresy called Legacies, a set of PDF rules for all the old units that don't have models anymore. But unlike 40k, they're considered acceptable in all forms of play, and people are actively really happy to see these old units on the table. No one ever stops you taking them, even in events. And as well as all that, since the game is based on an older rule set, it also tends to attract more veteran gamers, and those people might have less opportunity to play because of family commitments, or they've just grown up past the point where they really care about skill in wargaming. This means that Heresy tournaments are very rare, but the game still has a thriving event scene. Most Heresy events are just narrative events, usually 4 games over a weekend, themed around the battle over a specific world. People would buy tickets to play on either the loyalist or the traitor side. Those 2 sides would then be matched against each other, with one side, rather than one person, being declared the victor at the end. A lot of Heresy events I've been to don't even bother with best general as a prize. The important thing is, did the loyalists or the traitors take the world? In these events, themed or unique missions are very common, as are specific list building restrictions, like only having one of each Primarch present to add to the historical feel, like this is something really happening during the war. Of course, the downside of a massive focus on the narrative feel of a game is that Heresy players can have a little bit of a reputation for being quite snooty about using the correct period or the correct models or the correct paint scheme. Largely, that sort of rivet counting is a bit over-exaggerated. Obviously, like the power gamers, those people do exist, but the vast majority of players, I think, just want to feel like the player on the other side of the table from them put some effort in too, so the battle is going to feel like it's really happening. They want that sense of immersion that you can't really get if only one of you's doing it. So yeah, if you turn up with a ton of proxies or an unpainted army or an entire 40k Primaris army, people are probably going to be quite reticent to play you because it doesn't really do what they want from this game. It doesn't look and feel right. But generally, as long as some effort's put in, people are fine. I've seen plenty of third-party bits or 40k firstborn models with a little bit of kit bashing. There's no hard requirement for you to definitely use official Heresy models, as long as it kind of feels right. Also, the lore has gone out of its way to make sure that you can do different or unique colour schemes so that your specific army don't actually have to look like everyone else's. I've got a whole video here about making Heresy armies look unique, and there are loads of examples of variant schemes in all the books. Heresy is a really big game to get into. I understand why people find it daunting. It's one of the physically largest games, and its rules are on the more complex end for a Games Workshop wargame. But there are multiple ways in, loads of events, and the community are generally really welcoming, and now's a really good time. Everyone's in the same position right now, learning their way through a new edition. And if you already play 40k, you have Knights or Custodes, Sisters of Silence, or even some Firstborn Marines, then you've probably got the beginnings of a Horus Heresy army already, with a little bit of work. Come join us, relax, enter the narrative end of 40k, and come play the Horus Heresy. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about the world of Horus Heresy, I've got loads of lore videos, one's probably popping up to the right there. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's a merch store, there's a website, there's YouTube membership schemes and a Patreon, and you can always like and subscribe. See ya!